Estonia speaks a language its DNA says it shouldn't speak. Scientists opened ancient graves, expecting one story, and found the complete opposite. This genetic mystery rewrites everything we thought we knew about how identity actually works. Your language says you're one people, your DNA says you're another, and your ancestors, they tell a third story completely. Welcome to Estonia, where identity is a paradox science is still trying to solve. Estonia presents a genetic paradox, unlike anywhere else in Europe. That's not an opinion, it's a scientific mystery. Because Estonia speaks a Uralic language. Linguistically, it belongs with Finland, with peoples whose roots stretch deep into the forests of the Volga and beyond. And yet, when scientists opened the oldest graves in Estonian soil, the DNA told a completely different story. The genetic ancestry of Bronze Age Estonia is not primarily Uralic at all. It is Indo-European. That contradiction is where everything begins. For a long time, history assumed that language, culture, and blood always moved together, that people arrived as complete packages. But Estonia breaks that rule. Here, language went one way, and DNA went another. So the real question isn't where Estonians came from. It's what happens when a people inherit a land, but not the ancestry that first shaped it. This isn't folklore, it isn't legend. It comes from ancient DNA, from Bronze Age burials, from genome-wide studies that read bones like books. The evidence is precise, striking, and impossible to ignore. When geneticists tested Bronze Age Estonian males, 16 individuals from the corded ware period, they found something remarkable. Every single one carried a genetic signature called R1, all 16. No exceptions. R1 is the hallmark of Indo-European steppe populations, the same genetic wave that reshaped much of Europe thousands of years ago, which means the Bronze Age Estonians were not who modern Estonians linguistically resemble today. And if that sounds puzzling, it should. Because identity feels stable, ancestry feels inherited. But Estonia tells us something profound, that history can be overwritten without erasing the land itself. This channel exists to explore stories exactly like this. Stories buried under certainty. Stories unlocked by ancient DNA. If you're fascinated by lost histories and genetic mysteries that rewrite what we think we know, subscribe for more untold stories. But hold that thought, because the contradiction only gets sharper. If Bronze Age Estonian men were Indo-European and modern Estonians speak a Uralic language, then the most intriguing question is still waiting. So if modern Estonians don't share the same linguistic family as Bronze Age populations, what changed? And change is never simple. Change means movement, pressure, transformation. Which brings us to the shift that reshaped Estonia. When geneticists mapped the transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age in Estonia, they expected diversity. What they found instead was dramatic simplification, whole male lineages, reduced. Before the Bronze Age, the Baltic region carried various ancient Y chromosome lines, I2 from earlier hunter-gatherers, R1b from Western influences, even rarer markers that spoke of Ice Age foragers and early settlers. But when the corded ware culture arrived around 2900 to 2400 BCE, that diversity collapsed. Almost overnight in genetic time, one lineage dominated. Ra1a. Not gradually, not gently, at massive scale. Burial after burial told the same story. Different villages, different regions, different centuries. The male lineages showed overwhelming Ra1, a dominance. This wasn't just cultural influence, this was demographic transformation. And transformation raises important questions. Did the earlier populations integrate? Were they replaced? Or did they merge so completely that one genetic signal became dominant? Archaeology adds weight to the moment. Burial styles change, mobility increases. The economy shifts toward pastoral life. Horses, wagons, long-distance movement. A new way of living arrives, and it brought a genetic shift in paternal lineages. This was not just a migration, it was a transformation of ancestry. And yet something crucial happens when you look closer. Because while the male lines shifted dramatically, the female lines showed far more continuity. Mitochondrial DNA passed only from mothers tells a quieter story. The maternal lineages show remarkable persistence. Their genetic signatures stretch back thousands of years, maintaining connections to earlier populations. Ice Age ancestry survives through them, even as the paternal lines transform, which means Estonia wasn't emptied and refilled. It was transformed through integration. New men arrived. Local women's lineages continued. Families formed across ancestral backgrounds. Culture blended. Identity shifted, without anyone writing it down. And this is where the story turns again. Because if ancestry could transform once, it could transform again. And centuries later, from the east, another ancestry would arrive. Smaller, quieter, but powerful enough to change everything. But before we go there, one truth becomes clear. While the paternal lineages transformed, the maternal lineages showed continuity. Something remarkable emerges when we examine the genetics more carefully. The paternal lineages shift dramatically in the Bronze Age, but the population maintains deep continuity through maternal lines. When scientists stopped looking only at Y chromosomes and examined mitochondrial DNA, the DNA passed only from mother to child. The story revealed layers of persistence, generation after generation. Ancient maternal haplogroups continued. Haplogroups like U5, U4, and H, some of the oldest in Europe, kept appearing again and again. Every single mitochondrial DNA haplogroup found in ancient Estonian samples also exists in modern Estonians. The population changed, but retained deep maternal continuity. That's the pattern most people never expect. New paternal lineages arrived. The genetic landscape shifted. But this didn't happen to an empty land. Integration occurred with women whose roots in the Baltic region went back thousands of years. And through those maternal lines, something older than any Bronze Age migration survived. This is how populations transform without complete replacement. Children grew up in the cultural world of the corded ware culture, living new lifestyles, but carrying ancient Baltic ancestry through their mothers. The bones don't argue about this. The DNA is consistent, clear, undeniable. And yet, this changes how we understand population movements. Because Estonia's oldest ancestry did not vanish in transformation. It adapted, it integrated, it endured, through maternal lineages that never broke. This is not a story of simple replacement. It's a story of complex integration. But integration has its own dynamics. Centuries passed, generations blended together. And then, long after the steppe migrations had settled into history, something new appeared in the genetic record. Not from the west, not from the south, from the east. At first it was barely visible, easy to miss, almost insignificant. But this small signal would reshape linguistic identity in a way no major migration ever had. And that raises the next mystery. Because the ancestry that arrived next was too small to explain what came after. And yet, it changed everything. If you blink, you miss it. That's how subtle the next arrival was. When geneticists examined late Bronze Age and early Iron Age Estonian remains, they noticed something new, a Y chromosome lineage that had never appeared before in the region. Haplogroup N1C, a marker tied to Uralic-speaking populations far to the east, near the forests and river systems beyond the Volga. Before approximately 700–400 BCE, it simply wasn't there in Estonian samples. No earlier traces. Nothing. Then gradually, quietly, it appears. But here's the fascinating part. This new ancestry was small, very small. In modern Estonians, the Siberian-related genetic component linked to this migration is only around 5%. Too little to suggest invasion. Too little to suggest mass replacement. And yet, Estonia becomes Uralic-speaking. This is where the story defies simple expectations. Because usually languages spread with people, with numbers, with demographic dominance. But in Estonia, language impact exceeds genetic impact. A minority ancestry leaves a majority linguistic mark. That seems impossible, but it happens. There is no evidence of large-scale population replacement in this period, no genetic wipeout, no overwhelming eastern migration. Instead, we see something far more intriguing. A relatively small group arrives, and their language becomes dominant. How? Perhaps through trade networks, perhaps through social prestige, perhaps through cultural mechanisms that mattered more than numbers. Whatever the process, the result is undeniable. Estonia does not become Uralic-speaking because most people were Uralic by genetic ancestry. It becomes Uralic-speaking because language can shift without proportional genetic replacement. This is the paradox at the heart of Estonian genetics. Genes say one thing, language says another. Culture follows neither perfectly. And once you accept that, a much larger question opens up. Not just about Estonia, but about identity itself. If a minority can reshape linguistic identity without replacing a population, then what really defines who a people are? By now, the paradox is impossible to ignore. Estonia is genetically shaped primarily by Indo-European steppe ancestry and ancient Baltic maternal lineages, yet it speaks a Finno-Ugric language. That means something unusual happened here. Something that doesn't follow the simple models we were taught about ancestry. Because DNA changes slowly. Language does not. Language can transform in a few generations, sometimes even faster. It spreads through power, through utility, through who controls trade, alliances, and social networks. You don't need a population majority to change a language. You just need the right social dynamics. This is where Estonia's identity complexity becomes clear. The Uralic-speaking populations who arrived from the east were not demographically dominant. Their genetic footprint is modest, about 5% Siberian-related ancestry. But their cultural and linguistic footprint was decisive. Their language became the language of everyday life, spoken in homes, passed to children, embedded in memory. And once a language becomes the language of mothers and children, it doesn't matter how much different DNA the population carries. The linguistic identity is established, so Estonia becomes Uralic speaking on a predominantly Indo-European genetic foundation. Genetics say one thing, language says another. This isn't contradiction, it's how human populations work. We inherit identity socially. We learn who we are through culture, language, and tradition, long before we understand our genetic ancestry. Names, stories, rituals, sounds. These shape belonging more powerfully than chromosomes ever could, and Estonia demonstrates this in the most fascinating way possible. Because it means identity is not determined by a single factor, it's layered, negotiated, sometimes transformed by cultural shifts. But here's the mistake most people make next. They assume Estonia is genetically uniform after these changes. One people, one genetic pattern, one outcome. It isn't. Because once scientists stopped comparing Estonians to other populations and started comparing Estonians to each other, a quieter pattern emerged. Not dramatic, not political, but written clearly in the genome. And that internal variation tells its own story. Because Estonia doesn't just challenge how language spreads. It challenges the idea that a country contains only one ancestry pattern. The variation isn't dramatic, but it's measurable. When researchers analyze genetic patterns within Estonia, they notice something subtle but consistent. Estonians in the northeast cluster slightly closer to Finns. Estonians in the southeast show somewhat more connection to Baltic populations like Latvians and Lithuanians. Not enough to notice in daily life. Enough to detect in genomic analysis. Internal variation exists within shared identity. This isn't about modern politics or recent history. It reflects older patterns. Contact across the Gulf of Finland, interaction zones near Latvia, centuries of regional networks shaped by geography and tradition. Language remains shared, national identity remains shared, but ancestry carries subtle echoes of different contacts. Dialects mirror this, to some degree. So does folklore. Even patterns of settlement and marriage quietly reflect it. Not sharply, not divisively, just enough to leave a trace. And that's the important point. These differences don't divide Estonia into separate peoples. Instead, they reveal something more interesting. How a small country integrated multiple ancestral influences without fragmenting. Despite Indo-European steppe ancestry, ancient Baltic maternal continuity, Eastern Uralic linguistic influence, and regional variation, Estonia maintained coherent identity. And while much of Europe was transformed repeatedly by farmers, empires, and massive demographic waves, something older remained unusually strong in the Baltic region. Something most populations gradually diluted. Because beneath all this mixing, beneath steppe ancestry, Uralic language, and regional variation, Estonia preserved a genetic component that few other European populations maintained at such levels. A component older than agriculture, older than language families, older than recorded history. And that's where the story turns once more. Because to understand what makes Estonians truly distinctive in European genetics, we have to go all the way back, before farmers, before the Bronze Age migrations, back to the people who survived the ice. There is one genetic pattern that fundamentally shapes Estonia's distinctiveness. Among modern Europeans, Estonians carry among the highest levels of hunter-gatherer ancestry, older than farmers, older than steppe migrations, older than written history. This is not poetic language, it's genetic measurement. When farming spread across Europe starting around 7000 BCE, it transformed almost every population it touched. New subsistence strategies, new lifestyles, new genetic ancestry. But in the northeastern Baltic, the impact was weaker, slower, less complete. The region absorbed farming practices, but never experienced the massive farmer ancestry replacement seen in Central and Western Europe, and so something extraordinary occurred. While much of Europe saw ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry diluted to small percentages, the Baltic region retained it at much higher levels. Ancient forager ancestry did not disappear here. It persisted through millennia of climate change, through migrations, through linguistic transformation, through political changes. Layer after layer of new influences arrived, but the hunter-gatherer foundation endured. That persistence is significant, because it means Estonian genetics are not just mixed, they are deep. A genetic repository where some of Europe's oldest ancestries remain prominent. Not dominant, not pure, but persistent. Beneath Indo-European paternal lineages, beneath Uralic language, beneath modern borders. This is continuity without isolation, persistence through integration. And that resilience is the remarkable aspect of Estonia's genetic story. But when populations maintain such continuity, when they remain relatively connected within a region for long periods, when ancient lineages keep circulating, persistence creates specific patterns. Continuity doesn't just preserve the past, it shapes the present. And the effects of that shaping aren't buried in graves or ancient bones. They are observable today. Modern Estonia possesses one of the most valuable genetic resources on Earth, the Estonian biobank. Nearly 1/5 of the adult population, genotyped, studied, contributing to science. A living archive where ancient population history meets modern medical research. And what it reveals is not dramatic, it's precise, measurable, scientifically significant. Centuries of regional continuity, periods of relative genetic isolation, population bottlenecks that never fully dissipated. These demographic patterns enriched certain rare genetic variants, not because Estonia is genetically fragile, but because it maintained continuity. Some variants affect metabolism, others influence muscle physiology, some shape disease susceptibility in ways barely detectable elsewhere in Europe. Not widespread, not severe, but statistically observable. This is ancient population structure, playing out in modern genetics. The same demographic continuity that preserved high hunter-gatherer ancestry also allowed certain mutations to reach slightly higher frequencies than they might have otherwise. Enough to be medically relevant, enough to be noticed, once scientists had sufficient data, and when they analyzed the data closely, one discovery stood out. A mutation long attributed exclusively to Finland, taught as part of the Finnish disease heritage, considered someone else's genetic story. Until Estonian genomic data rewrote the narrative, the mutation was present in Estonia too. Not rarely, not as obvious spillover, with patterns suggesting its origins might not be solely Finnish at all. It might have Estonian roots. And in that realization, the story transforms again, because Estonia isn't just preserving ancient European ancestry, it's correcting modern scientific assumptions. And the more carefully scientists analyze, the more previous conclusions require revision. Which leads us to a crucial question. What happens when even medical genetics has incomplete geographic attribution? And what else, present in the data all along, have we been interpreting incompletely? For decades, this mutation had a clear attribution. It was documented that way, named that way, repeated in medical literature and genetic studies. The Feinmage mutation, a variant in the TTN gene, was considered primarily or exclusively Finnish, part of what researchers termed the Finnish disease heritage, a genetic signature tied to population isolation, founder effects, and demographic history in Finland. And for a long time, this attribution went largely unquestioned, until Estonian genomic data reached sufficient scale. When scientists began analyzing Estonian genomes systematically through the biobank and other studies, the Feinmage mutation appeared repeatedly, in families without recent Finnish ancestry, in regions geographically distant from expected migration routes, consistently embedded in the population. Initially, it appeared to be genetic flow from Finland, secondary distribution, nothing more. But the patterns didn't support that simple explanation. The mutation wasn't rare in Estonia. Its distribution didn't fit a simple diffusion model from Finland, and its frequency suggested deeper presence than recent gene flow would predict. Gradually, researchers had to consider a possibility that challenged decades of assumptions. What if the mutation didn't originate in Finland and spread to Estonia? What if Estonia was closer to its geographic origin? What if the Finnish disease heritage was actually shared or even primarily Baltic? Genetics has a way of doing this, correcting narratives based on incomplete data. The genomic evidence doesn't negotiate. It doesn't respect previous conclusions. It simply reveals patterns. And the patterns emerging from recent 2024 to 2025 research suggested something important, that a genetic variant long associated exclusively with Finnish population history might actually have Estonian origins, or at minimum, shared Baltic origins that predate modern national boundaries. That modern medical genetics had inherited an attribution based on where the variant was first extensively studied, not necessarily where it originated. This is where ancestry becomes medically relevant, because these aren't ancient remains. These are living people, families planning futures. Medical decisions influenced by genetic risk assessment. Ancestry is not just about understanding the past. It's about accurately assessing present-day health risks. And when genetic attribution shifts, medical screening recommendations must shift with it. Which brings us back to the fundamental question we've been circling. If genomics can rewrite medical attributions, if language can transform without proportional genetic replacement, if identity persists even when ancestry is complex, then what exactly does it mean to belong to a population? And that question brings us full circle, back to Estonia itself. Estonia is not one simple story. It never was. It is a genetic and cultural mosaic, built gradually, unevenly, through multiple transformations. Indo-European steppe paternal lineages, ancient Baltic maternal continuity, a Uralic language carried by a demographic minority, regional variations layered into shared national identity. None of these elements cancels the others out. They coexist. And that is the mistake many historical narratives make. They search for singular origins when they should be examining complex processes. They look for purity, where reality offers layered continuity instead. In Estonia, genetics, language, and culture tell different but complementary truths, and all of them are valid. Genetics reveal deep continuity with ancient hunter-gatherers. Language reveals cultural transformation through Uralic influence. National identity reveals choices made across centuries. Together, they form something more accurate than any single origin story could provide. Estonian identity was not inherited whole from one source. It was constructed, integrated across millennia, passed down through maternal lineages that showed remarkable continuity, paternal lineages that transformed dramatically, and languages that shifted cultural orientation without erasing genetic foundations. This is not confusion. This is human population history. Because if Estonia teaches us anything, it is that identity is not genetically deterministic. It bends with culture. It overlaps across ancestries. It absorbs change and maintains continuity simultaneously, carrying traces of both transformation and persistence. And perhaps that's the real insight buried in its genetics. That identity is not what replaces you. It's what integrates and endures. So if a population can survive paternal lineage transformation, linguistic shift, and cultural change while maintaining genetic continuity, what truly defines population identity? And if Estonia's story reveals this complexity, what other European identities are built on equally intricate foundations?